Good afternoon. I'm retired Professor Harold Borns. I'm a glacial geologist from the University of Maine at Orono, Maine. And we're here this afternoon to look at a film of the expedition, one of Byrd's expeditions to the Antarctic, taken by a man named John, I think it was John Herman. Let's backtrack. Sorry, it's not John. What was it? Yeah, John. Well, let's start all over again. Okay. Good afternoon. I'm Harold Borns. I'm a glacial geologist from the University of Maine, and we're here to look at a silent film taken by John Herman. He was a representative of the Paramount News and Film Company. And he went on the 1933 to 1935 Antarctic trip of Admiral Richard E. Byrd. He took films in a professional way, and they belong with the expedition archives, but he took this one for his own interest. And one way or another, it ended up in the hands of one of his relatives that lives here in Orono, a man named Mark Lappin. And Mark Lappin gave it to the Hudson Museum here on the University of Maine campus, and that's where it is. It's a silent film, and what I will do is narrate it. In my case, I've spent 28 years in the United States Antarctic program doing field geology on that continent, and so I have a pretty good idea of the histories involved of the earlier expeditions as well as my own. But first of all, I'd like to talk about Admiral Byrd for a minute, just to set the stage. Admiral Richard E. Byrd was born in 1888 and died in 1957. He was a polar explorer, really a good one, and introduced air travel to polar explorations. He was born in into the Byrd family, a prominent family from Winchester, Virginia, and in many ways, he was brought up to be independent, and when he was 12 years old, he was sent by himself on a trip around the world, which he did. I can't quite imagine that, but people met him on different sections of the trip and escorted him here and there. But 12 years old, you have to be pretty much of an adventurer to do that at that time. He introduced polar flights. And he graduated from the Naval Academy, but he had a problem after a few years with a leg, and they discharged him from the active duty roster, and he stayed in as an inactive reserve officer and went to the Antarctic with the well-being and help of the United States Navy. So he was still being supported, and he continued to do that, and he rose in rank to be a rear admiral. He was the first person to fly over the North Pole, and that was done in 1926, and he went over the South Pole in 1934. He led expeditions to the Antarctic, privately supported expeditions with some help from the Navy. The first one was in 1928 to 1930, and the next one was 1933 to 1935. In 1939, he was recalled by the Navy, 1939 and 40, at the beginning of World War II. And he was called into service to lead another expedition into the Antarctic at that time, probably something to do with the politics of Antarctica and the war. He did it again in 1946 with a program called Operation High Jump, and there were 4,000 people in the Antarctic on that expedition, and they did a rather tremendous survey of the continent. In 1957 and 58, he did the same thing once again in the modern world when the United States Antarctic program actually got underway. And that was done during the International Geophysical Year of 1958 and has continued to this day as a very active program and a very important one to understand global climate changes and other features such as sea level changes. Antarctica is a primary mover and shaker in those fields. It was long recognized thanks to a lot of the work supported and carried out by the Byrd expeditions since 1928. He lived on Broomer Street in Boston, Mass, right in the shadow of Beacon Hill, and he spent his summers starting in 1937 at Tunk Lake, Maine. And many of his books, such as Alone, which is a well-known book, was written sitting on a raft in the middle of Tunk Lake, Maine, dictating to his secretary and patting his dog Igloo, according to his daughter. He's buried in Arlington Cemetery, and here at the University of Maine, we have a large rock that we call the Byrd Rock. I had the responsibility of retrieving a rock for Admiral Byrd's gravesite when I was a program manager in glaciology at the National Science Foundation. And I did that and brought it back, but the family never used it. It's a very unusual rock, characteristic of Antarctica. Weighs a couple of tons. It's full of very funny holes due to something called salt weathering. And the family gave it to the University of Maine on a loan basis, and that's where it is today. It wasn't used on his cemetery lot for some reason I'm not quite sure of. The Hudson Museum at Orono has a good collection of Byrd memorabilia that came by various routes from Admiral Byrd's family to the museum, and along with it came this film. And that's what we're going to sort of take a look at. One other thing to say about Byrd, he named many locations, that some of which are in common use today in the Antarctic. Marie Byrd Land, Mount Sidley, Horlick Mountains, the Ford Ranges. He mapped an area about the size of 1/2 of the United States, and included the naming and finding of 10 mountain ranges. So he did quite a lot on his 2 expeditions. So what I'd like to do now is walk over to an Antarctic map and point some of these locations out to you. This is a map of the Antarctic as we know it today. Back in his days, we didn't know much about it at all. But his expeditions of 1928 to roughly 2 of them through 1930, is that the right, yeah, about that, landed at the Bay of Whales, and that's right here. If you go this direction, you come to New Zealand about 2,000 miles to the north. So they came through New Zealand to this point, and they set up a camp, and they called it Little America. A little bit more about that. The South Pole today is here. That's the exit of the spin axis of the Earth. And this is in the southern hemisphere, of course. And this ice mass in here is called the East Antarctic Ice Sheet. And it's separated from the West Antarctic Ice Sheet by the Transantarctic mountain range that comes down through here and goes up into South America. Over here, it continues in this direction up. Here in southern South America is over here. At the present time, the United States has its main logistics base here at a place called McMurdo Sound, and it shares a base at the South Pole with New Zealand. And there are around 25 other countries on Earth that have joined the Antarctic Treaty, and they have stations situated at various places, including this long thing called the Antarctic Peninsula today. Well, once he got here, they set up the base, and Once they did that, they started the exploration work, a lot of which was done by dog team to nearby locations, but the rest of it was done by airplane, and they covered this area in here, which has been subsequently called Marie Byrd Land, after Admiral Byrd's wife. I believe I should know that. It's either his mother or his wife, but it's Marie Byrd Land in here. And he named various mountain ranges through here for people and companies that supported him, like Edsel Ford, the Horlick Range. He got up into this area in these mountains. One of the ranges is called the Horlick Range, named after Horlick Mounted Milk Company. Mr. Horlick's daughter was Mrs. Sidley, and the Sidley Mountains are right in here. I spent some time in that location years ago, and so forth. So he did an awful lot of mapping, including a flight from Little America to the South Pole and then back again. And he was the first person to do that, with the help of a Norwegian Air Force colonel named Bernt Balken, who today, he died, but his wife today and child live in Jonesport, Maine, for what it's worth. So there we are. Just to point out the continent itself, the West Antarctic ice sheet, if it was to collapse and disappear into the oceans of the world, it would produce a 20-foot sea level rise everywhere on Earth. This one would produce a much larger one. There are about 3 miles of ice in this center, and if you took this away, you'd have a continent under, a dry continent. If you took this away, you would have an open ocean with lots of islands in it, like northern Canada is today. So there's a difference in the two ice sheets. That's about all I want to tell you about this. And as we go along with the movie, I'll point out or say or talk about where these places are, but it gives you a sense. I might say that the East Antarctic ice sheet flows out onto the ocean in this area through the mountains. The West Antarctic ice sheet does the same thing. This area right here is called the Ross Ice Shelf. It's floating in about 3,000 feet of water, and it's constantly moving forward and breaking off into some of these immense tabular icebergs that we talk about occasionally that turn out to be the size of Rhode Island and make the news quite regularly. The constant flowage of ice from both these sources and breaking off along this margin. The margin of where it breaks off is called the Ross Barrier. It's floating edge of the ice, and we'll see pictures of it in the movie. Keep in mind, this is a film produced by John L. Herman, who was assigned by Paramount News to the 1933 to 35 Antarctic expedition of Richard E. Byrd. He took professional pictures of the expedition in an organized way, but this film is one he made himself, and it's kind of eclectic. It's sort of all over the place, different shots of different things, and I'll try to interpret those as we go along. It comes to a rather abrupt end, but that's to be looked at in the future, so not worry about it. Here we have the map, sort of a map that was available in that time period of the Antarctic, and didn't know much about it. A lot of blank space on that map that didn't come to light until the United States got into the International Geophysical Year in 1958, along with other countries, and we started to make sense out of the Antarctic at that time. This is a sailing ship with a steam engine. We'd evolved to that point, and the Jacob Ruppert, and they're loading it in Boston. Jacob Ruppert was one of the people that sponsored the expedition. We just saw a picture of some cows. I'll talk to you a little bit later about the cows. Here they are leaving the dock. He had two ships, the Jacob Rupert, which was a steamship, and the Bear of Oakland, which you just saw with the masts. This is the Bear of Oakland. It's both sail and steam. They departed Boston in October of 1933, and they arrived in the Antarctic in February of 1934. And during the expedition, of course, they managed, in this case, coal bags and other things, and obviously plenty of work to keep the crew and the expedition people working. They traveled from Boston to Panama, and then from Panama to Easter Island in the Pacific, and then down to New Zealand, which is a traditional jumping off point for the turn of the century Antarctic, British Antarctic expeditions. This is a sledge that exists in the Hudson Museum now at the University of Maine, and for a long time they didn't know where it had come from. It has a design of an Athabascan Indian sled, and for a while it was thought that it was purchased from them, but it turns out they built it right there on the ship according to that design, and you just saw the man with a saw doing it. It's a very lightweight, very, very flexible sled. You can see it in the background for traveling on ice and snow. These are sled dogs, mostly from Moultonborough, New Hampshire. And the Moultonborough, New Hampshire, the Moulton family raised sled dogs for many, many expeditions to the Antarctic and to the Arctic. And they still raise them today. However, we don't use dogs in the Antarctic by international decree. They do more damage to the wildlife down there than people wanted to see. So all the traveling in the Antarctic, over the snow traveling, is done by motor vehicles. Jacob Rupert again. I'd be sick of the dog. You notice there was an airplane in that picture. They had two airplanes. They brought one down and they dug one out from the previous expedition. This is the second expedition of Admiral Byrd. The first one, 1928 to 1930, to the same location, and then this is the 1933 to 35 expedition. Here they are in the Southern Ocean, approaching Antarctica, I presume, and the weather doesn't look too bad. Today, you get on an airplane in Christchurch, New Zealand, and land in the Antarctic 4 hours later. This is at least a several-day trip, maybe a week, depending upon wind conditions for a sailing ship. They've entered the broken sea ice. This is called sea ice, frozen ocean ice, and it's quite easily broken by a ship that has plenty of power and a strong front end to it. You have to approach, these boats had to approach the Antarctic in late Antarctic summer. You know, keep in mind the summer in the Antarctic starts in the southern hemisphere, starts in October and ends around March. Christmas is midsummer, whereas June 22nd is midsummer here in the northern hemisphere. It's just 6 months, half a world away in different situation. So they have to wait until the sea ice melts away enough from around the continent so that they can get into the place where they want to land. So therefore they end up in the summer. They've come to the Antarctic, they've come to the edge of the Ross Ice Shelf that I just pointed out, and they've landed at the Bay of Whales. It's a place where the ice actually slopes down to the sea, whereas along the rest of the barrier it's a vertical cliff of about 200 feet high. The reason for this is a geological reason. There's a big island upstream from this, and the island breaks it up in a way to do this now. And what they're doing is digging. You see, this is the 1933 expedition. They're digging out Little America from the 1928 expedition that's been totally buried by snow. This is a Citroen vehicle they're offloading, trying it out. This is the first motorized vehicle, I think, in the Antarctic, or pretty close to it. Although he had an earlier one, I don't know if it was this expedition, that had tires that were about 10 feet tall, and it just simply didn't work. This time they're using tracked vehicles, and they're still having trouble crossing crevasses, as you can see. Talk about cold Maine winters or New England winters. Here comes the cows. There are 2 cows, or 3 cows, from the J.C. Penney farm in New York. One of them was called Iceberg, born just short of the Antarctic Circle, and then Klondike was a Guernsey bull. Well, they expect Klondike to do his job and produce more small cows by the end of the second year that they were here, but he chose not to have anything to do with the ladies for reasons that no one could quite understand. And they're just pulling equipment up to the site of the old buried camp. A lot of these things, I have no idea what they were using them for, but as I said, this is an eclectic film. It's sort of shots of a little bit of everything here and there. The original film, this is a reproduction of that film, and the original film isn't any better than this in terms of contrast. A lot of very dark looking things, and I don't know why that is, but in Antarctica there's an enormous amount of light, much more than you ever encounter here, and it's very difficult to do photography against a pure white, very bright atmospheric background. They're driving dogs here in a way that is, this is the Antarctic method of driving dogs in a line. The Greenland method that the Eskimos use is a fan of dogs out in front of the sled. For some reason they chose this method, which was used by the Norwegians when they first attained the pole in 1912. That's the same sled that's in the museum today. They're going through some sort of a pressure ridge here. I don't quite understand it, but it's where the ice has been forced to crumple. Maybe there's a subsurface landmass, and it's being interfering with the flow of ice, and it's doing this and breaking up. It makes it very difficult going. See the seal? They're on sea ice. Matter of fact, that's why, come to think of it, that's why that's pressure ridge is there. It's the ocean ice that's squeezed up, probably because the wind has blown the sea ice. That's their ship. Probably leaving, They can't stay there for the winter, so they're going to head back to the north, and then the expedition will settle in the in the fall, late summer and fall of 1928, when the sun comes up again because it's pitch black during the winter. Then they'll do their ration. Then it will be pitch black again, and they'll wait through the winter, and then at the end of the summer, when the sea ice is open again, the ship will come back and take them out. That's the usual sequence. Here they are, still uncovering old Little America, well below the snow. The buildings in that situation act as snow fences, and they bury themselves, more or less. The average snowfall on the Antarctic continent is about a half an inch a year. Just a half an inch compared to, it will snow more in Bangor, Maine in one storm than it might snow in the whole Antarctic for the whole year. It's hard to believe, but the difference is the snow never melts. Look at the clothing. That one in particular, the dark-colored one, clothing, and Admiral Byrd, this is Admiral Byrd, and he's in clothing. He asked to have a special fabric made that was windproof, very thin, very durable, and very windproof. And it's called Byrd cloth to this day. And several of the older expedition people in the early days of the IGY in 1958, International Geophysical Year work, still used Byrd cloth, and it was still being made. Today, we've come a long ways past that in types of polar clothing that we use. But they're basically windproof over long underwear and sweaters and everything else. The layer method of keeping warm, rather than one big heavy coat. This is the airplane they brought down with them. I don't know the name of it. The other one is a double-wing Fokker, Netherlands made, and it's there under the snow, and you'll see they had to dig it out. The air is very cold in the Antarctic, and it's easy to get off the ground because the cold air is heavy air, and it gives you a lot of lift, but obviously they landed that the wrong way. That snow, by the way, is not too out in the field away from where they've been digging, is pretty hard-packed stuff. It's not soft and fluffy, as you might expect, simply because the wind conditions are so fierce down there. You get winds in the winter of 200-300 miles an hour at least. I guess this is the pilot that got banged up in that accident, although I don't know who it is. Slow work. This is, again, in the end of summer, so they're working furiously to get done before winter sets in. And keep in mind, in this continent, at this position, you have 6 months of total darkness and then 6 months of total sunlight. The same is true in the Arctic as well as the Antarctic. So they're trying to get this really tucked away and everything organized and shipshape before they go into the old buildings under the snow and get ready for spending the next 6 months of the winter there. These are tough people, I might say. They had more volunteers for these expeditions, pure volunteers, than you can imagine. Hundreds of people volunteered for all of these early Antarctic expeditions. And the early British ones, the bills of asking people to volunteer said little pay and little hope of returning. And yet hundreds of people signed up for them. That's Admiral Byrd getting his airplane lined up. He's a pilot, but he didn't do the piloting down there. He did the navigation. And Bert Balkan and other pilots, they had about 6 pilots, actually, all together with the expedition. They weren't going to spend the winter in those tents. Like any of the modern expeditions, oh, by the way, notice the smokestacks coming out of the buildings that are below the snow. Like all modern expeditions, they did a lot of science rather than straight geographic exploration. And this is a case in point. They did geology on this trip, meteorology, upper atmospheric studies, various types. The aurora, or aurora australis, rather than aurora borealis, as we get up in the northern part here. You always have to remember, if that plane gets very far out and crashes, there's no hope of getting back. You're just there. No one's going to come and get you. I think those are the pilots, mostly plotting flights. That one on the right is Bernd Balken, the Norwegian Air Force officer. Notice that's a twin aircraft, twin engine. That's the William Horlick, named for Horlick Malted Milk people. That is out of sequence. It was actually in the snow, and they dug it out. You'll see them digging it out a little bit later. One of the interesting things, these companies like the Horlick Malted Milk Company sent bags of malted milk tablets down for people. Another company owned the grape nuts company, and they sent tons of grape nuts down. They fed the grape nuts to the dogs and the cows until the dogs and cows refused to eat it anymore. As I would. They're flying along the edge of the Ross Barrier. That's a floating mass of ice. And you see the cliff. This cliff is about 200 to 300 feet high in most places. And it's floating in 3,000 feet of water. That's why we have these big tabular icebergs that break off. They're flat things the size of states. That type of country you're looking at now was very, very difficult for the early explorers who used dog teams. In one case of the Norwegians, but in going to the South Pole, and sleds, but the British hauled their own sleds manually over that kind of terrain for 2 months, carrying all of the food and sleeping gear and everything with them. Of course, the British died on the way back from the pole. They never made it. I might say at this point, the University of Maine has the largest group of Antarctic researchers in this country, and is recognized over a good deal of the world for its work in this continent as well as elsewhere. Most people don't realize that. Now we're looking at the mountain ranges. This must be a flight either along the coast of Marie Byrd Land or in over the Trans-Antarctic Mountains, and I can't tell which. Once that sun goes down, it's down for 6 months. Those guys probably are geologists. I'm not sure. They look like it. Who else would climb rocks and wonder what they are all about? That flag is in the Hudson Museum, by the way. They carried those little flags, and when the expeditions got, these are not the ones that are flying, these are the ones that are walking, and they'd be out in the field for a month or two. They'd carry these little flags. This is by the way, the Fokker aircraft called the Jacob, the Horlick, that was left from the earlier expedition. They left it in 1930 and it got buried. But I was saying those little flags were put up at the furthest point that the people with the sleds achieved. And they all wrote their names on them, and we have several of those flags here at Orono. Gift of the Byrd family. The little penguins are the common ones. They're called Adelie penguins.
And in the midst of their preparations, the blizzard strikes.
I don't know where that came from. It's a mystery to me. If he could do that, why didn't they do it for the whole film? This is what happens when snow blows. It's very, very fine, penetrates crevasses and everything. Tents, sleeping bags. You think you've got troubles with Maine winters again, you know. They had with them 154 dogs. Most of them survived, and of course they brought them home. They didn't turn them loose. They all came from New Hampshire. And that is the end of the summer. Now they're in for the winter. That's in February. March, or probably March. And they have all sorts of things to do in the winter, and you can see they're skinning something and probably working on seal skins of some sort. A penguin or two. In the early days of this type of exploration, a lot of explorers had all their teeth removed and their appendix taken out before the expedition. For this reason, right here. There's always fun and games. This is the Columbia Broadcasting System. And on February 1st, in 1934, Admiral Byrd made the first broadcast of a human voice around the world using Columbia Broadcasting. The first human voice from Antarctica. And I understand that he made regular broadcasts on Saturday nights from Antarctica. And back in the 1930s, I was a little kid. I didn't know it, but my father told me all about it. And a lot of people would sit down and just be enthralled by the whole thing. The general rule is you don't make pets out of sled dogs, but obviously they had some pets. They must have made that cradle out of a bunch of old boxes by the looks of it. By the way, it was during this winter that Admiral Byrd decided he would like to live by himself for several months. And so they left Little America. Well, they did this before the sun went down. They went out about 100 miles onto the ice and dug a big hole in the ground in the snow and put a big box in it, the top of which was level with the snow, and it had a trap door on it. And it had food and fuel and a stove, books, scientific equipment to measure wind velocities and temperatures and so forth. And he spent several months. When the sun went down and it was very dark, he moved into that all by himself, and a book came out of it called Alone. Very popular book, and it's still really a good book to read today. It gives you a real sense of getting along with yourself in a very perilous place. Unfortunately, he was getting poisoned by the fumes from his stove and didn't know it. And his broadcasts, news broadcasts to the world, as well as back to the Little America, here they're going out to get him. He finally got sick. When they traveled out to get him, they tried several times, but the weather was really too bad and windy. It's pitch black. Temperatures are probably 50 below zero at least at that time. But they got him finally on the second trip, and he was pretty nearly dead when they got him. But carbon monoxide is a very insidious gas. This doesn't smell, and it will kill you. And then people, of course, are killed using small tents, small fires and kerosene things in tents and so forth. One of the successful flights, I suspect it was the one to the pole, although I don't know that. A lot of congratulatory handshaking and so forth. Here we have some more. The little ones are Adelie penguins, and the big ones are a different species. And that's the end. As I said, the film ends very abruptly with no continuation to it. But again, John Herman made this for his own use and never turned it into the expedition. And there it is. If you would like to see this film again, contact the Hudson Museum at the University of Maine in Orono. Thank you.